Ever get that feeling like you're trying to, really grasp something massive, something that seems to be impacting everything around us?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
It's exactly where we are today.
Mhm.
We're diving headfirst into this connection between what we call value, like economically speaking thing, price tags, market forces, all that, and the deeper values we hold as a society, the ethical ones.
Right.
And lucky for us, we have a pretty amazing roadmap for this journey, Mark Carney's values. It's a really comprehensive book. Consider this, like our express lane to understanding how these two things are intertwined, how they impact each other, in sometimes surprising ways.
And without getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly, without getting lost in the weeds. No jargon overload here. Our goal today is to really break down how this growing emphasis on monetary value
Yeah.
is affecting those things we truly care about as a society, our values.
It's a really important question. And it's something you see everywhere, right? I mean, think about it. Money has become the go-to measure for almost everything.
It really has.
It's not just about, like, the cost of stuff anymore. This way of thinking, this logic, it's creeping into healthcare, education, even how we view the environment.
No, absolutely.
It's like if something can be bought or sold, then its value is often reduced to just its market price, you know?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, right? This whole idea of buying and selling. It's almost as if we're turning everything into some kind of like commodity.
Exactly. When something becomes a commodity, it's basically just an object for trade, just a means to an end. And usually that end is, well, financial gain.
Right.
And we might think our core beliefs or societal values, they're kind of untouchable, separate from all this.
Right, right.
But, Carney makes a really compelling point early in the book. When the price tag becomes the main way we measure things, well, it inevitably shifts our perspective. Our values, they're not actually set in stone. They can change, sometimes subtly, as a response to these economic shifts.
So how do we even start to measure this value thing we keep talking about? And where does money fit into all this? It feels so fundamental.
Chapters 3 and 4 of Values dive right into this. Throughout history, money's been our main tool for, gauging economic value.
Yeah.
And the nature of money itself, well, it's gone through some major changes.
Oh, yeah.
We've moved from currencies that were directly linked to a physical commodity like gold to what we use today.
Fiat money.
Fiat money, exactly.
That's the stuff that's not backed by gold, right?
Yeah.
It's just its values because, well, we all kind of agree it has value.
Yeah, you got it. And here's a really key insight. Carney really emphasizes that the value of this fiat money, it's not just random, it's actually built on a foundation of, you guessed it, societal values.
Like what?
Like trust in the institutions that issue and manage it, integrity in how they do that, and transparency in their operations. If those underlying values start to weaken, well, the whole system becomes a lot more fragile.
So, okay, let's get to the really exciting part. What about the future of money? I mean, we've seen cryptocurrencies come onto the scene, sort of disrupting the traditional system. What does Carney think about all that?
Chapter 5 is all about that. In some ways, cryptocurrencies are a response to a feeling of mistrust in those traditional financial authorities. People are looking for alternative systems that function outside of those existing structures.
Right.
But Carney brings up a really fascinating and maybe even a bit unsettling possibility, the monetization, if you will, of our social capital.
Well, hold on. Break that down for me. What do you mean?
Think about those trust scores on social media or even broader social credit systems. Could our social standing, our reputation actually become a form of currency itself? It really makes you think about the future, how all these different types of value could interact.
It does. And it makes me think that we're not just in a market economy anymore. Carney touches on this shift too, right?
All right. Absolutely. He argues pretty convincingly that we've moved beyond simply having a market economy, where markets play a big but limited role. We've become a full-blown market society. And this change, it has some pretty profound consequences for how we live together.
So what are these big consequences? What are we talking about here?
One of the most significant is that this shift is undermining our basic social contract. That unspoken agreement we have as a society about a relative equality of outcomes, a genuine level playing field with equal opportunities for everyone, and a sense of fairness across generations. When we start to see everything mainly through the lens of market value, well, these essential principles, they start to get weaker.
So the very way we're valuing things is contributing to some of the major issues we're seeing in the world today.
That's a core argument in values. In part two of the book, Carney looks at three of the biggest crises of the 21st century: the 2008 global credit crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ongoing climate crisis. And he argues that if you really dig deep, there's a common thread running through all of them: a crisis of values.
Okay, let's take that credit crisis. How did our values, or maybe a lack of certain values, play a part there?
Chapter 7 really goes in depth on this. It highlights how something Carney calls market fundamentalism, that strong belief in minimal regulation, the idea that asset bubbles can't be identified, and an almost unshakable faith in the market's efficiency, how all of that directly contributed to the crisis. Both the authorities and many market players bought into what Carney calls the three lies of finance.
Three lies. Okay, I'm intrigued. What are they?
First, this time is different. That very human tendency to think the old rules of economics and risk, they don't apply to our current situation.
Right.
Second, markets are always right. This belief that markets, if just left alone, will always lead to the best, most efficient results.
Okay.
And third, maybe most surprisingly, markets are moral. This idea that the efficiency of the market somehow means ethical behavior.
Wow. Those are some pretty powerful, and looking back, clearly flawed assumptions that had, well, huge consequences.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, like, why we fall for these things.
It really does. Why do we?
You know, it's fascinating. That first lie, this time is different. It probably taps into our natural tendency to be optimistic, that sense that progress always moves forward, markets are always right. Maybe it reflects a desire for, simple, efficient systems, a belief in this almost mathematical perfection. And markets are moral. That could be a way to justify self-interest, to convince ourselves that chasing profit is inherently a good thing.
Right.
But these seemingly logical fallacies, they can become deeply embedded in our thinking and lead to significant systemic risk.
Yeah, it's like instead of building up trust and shared values that social capital, Carney talks about the credit crisis, did the opposite.
Exactly. Instead of strengthening that social capital, the trust and shared values that are so vital for a healthy society, the credit crisis actually ate away at it. Think about the bailouts of those too big to fail banks. That created a situation where a select few were operating with a safety net that wasn't available to everyone else, which really damaged public trust.
And then there were those equity markets that seemed to favor like the big institutions with their fancy tools over us regular everyday investors.
Right. And again, that erodes the sense of a level playing field. That feeling of shared responsibility for the system's stability, it weakens. And sometimes it even felt like reckless behavior was being rewarded.
And then, of course, we have the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Carney says this is the ultimate test of our values. Why is that?
He points out a few key things. First, it's global, right? No single country can solve this alone. Everyone's going to be affected. Second, the science is pretty clear. There's a strong consensus about the risks if we don't act. And third, the best way to tackle this is through proactive, collective action, a sense of global solidarity.
It all comes down to that intergenerational equity idea, right? We're basically pushing huge costs and risks onto future generations without fully facing the consequences ourselves now.
Exactly. Chapter 11 introduces this really powerful concept, the tragedy of the horizon. The worst impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, extreme weather events, all of that, they're mostly going to be felt beyond the typical timeframes that businesses, investors, even central bankers operate in. By the time the effects are undeniable for most decision makers, it might be too late to avoid the worst outcomes. It's a sobering thought, and it really highlights the challenge of taking action on these long-term threats.
So this constant focus on market value, this market fundamentalism, it's not just failing to address these crises, it might actually be making them worse because it's eroding the very values we need to solve them.
That's one of the key takeaways, yeah. Unchecked market fundamentalism, it eats away at that social capital that capitalism itself needs to thrive in the long term. Markets alone can't create the trust, that shared purpose, the common values that are essential for a healthy society. And a healthy market, for that matter, we need to actively nurture those things.
But it's not just about avoiding the bad stuff.
Yeah.
There's a positive side to this whole value and values connection, right?
Yeah.
Like actively living by our values can actually strengthen them.
Absolutely. Carney uses this really great analogy. He compares values to muscles. The more you use them, the stronger they get. When we actively choose to live by our values, fairness, responsibility, compassion, those values become more ingrained in our actions and our decisions. And this brings us to something really important that Chapter 14 explores purposeful companies.
Okay, purposeful company. So we're talking about businesses that are about more than just, raking in profits for shareholders.
That's it. They're companies that deliberately align their core purpose with creating long-term value for all their stakeholders, not just shareholders, employees, suppliers, customers, the communities they operate in, everyone.
So it's about having a mission that goes beyond just making money. It's about having a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, exactly. When a company's purpose is genuine, when it's really woven into how they do business, it creates the sense of solidarity among stakeholders, a commitment to sustainability across generations. And this wider focus, it can actually lead to more innovation, more engaged employees, stronger customer loyalty, and ultimately even higher profits in the long run. It's a win-win when it's done right.
This all makes me wonder, how did we even get to this point where market value seems to be the dominant lens we see everything through? Has it always been like this, or is this a more recent thing?
Heart of Values takes us on a really fascinating journey through the history of how we've thought about value, and it shows that this dominance of market value, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Carney goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, to Aristotle.
Okay.
Aristotle considered the idea of a just price, a price rooted in the labor involved and the usefulness of a good or service. And all of this was within a bigger ethical framework concerned with justice. Then, in the Middle Ages, philosopher-theologians saw economics as inseparable from ethics and morality.
So a very different perspective from the often seemingly value-neutral approach to economics we see today.
Definitely. And the influence of these earlier thinkers, it gradually faded, especially after the Reformation. We saw a shift towards what we now call political economy, with the mercantilists and the physiocrats. They were more focused on the practical aspects of wealth and power, but it was really the Industrial Revolution that kicked off the development of formal economic theories of value, leading us to the classical economists Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx.
The big names, right?
Yeah.
The foundational figures. What were their main ideas about value?
Well, Smith, who's often misunderstood, argued that labor was the real measure of value, the real standard by which the value of all goods and services could be compared and exchanged. He distinguished this real value from the nominal price, the price in terms of money.
So the value of something wasn't just about how much money it could fetch.
Right. He also cautioned against simply equating money with capital and emphasized the importance of the social context surrounding all this economic activity.
And Ricardo.
Ricardo gave us the law of diminishing marginal returns, which had big implications for his ideas on trade. And then there's Marx, who, while also focusing on labor as the primary source of value, what he called use value, he developed these concepts of labor power and surplus value, emphasizing the role of class struggle in how wealth is distributed.
So while their approaches were different, they all seemed to agree that labor was a fundamental element of value.
Exactly. Then, in the late 19th century, came the neoclassical revolution with thinkers like Jevons, Menger, Walras, and Marshall. This marked a major shift in focus towards subjective utility, the idea that the value of something depends on how much an individual wants it, and the use of marginal analysis to understand economic decisions.
And that's where supply and demand really come into play
Right.
as the big forces determining value.
Yeah, exactly. Walras developed his influential general equilibrium model, illustrating how interconnected the whole economy is. It's that idea that everything depends upon everything else.
Right.
And Marshall, he synthesized these ideas, bringing together both supply and demand as the forces that determine value.
So how did this neoclassical perspective lead to our current focus on market value?
Well, the combination of this subjective value theory, which can easily lead to the idea that price equals value, and a simplified interpretation of Adam Smith's invisible hand, the idea that free markets naturally lead to the best outcomes, it all fostered this view that everything the market produces is inherently value creation. And this perspective, it can sometimes make us miss things that are incredibly valuable to us as individuals and as a society, but aren't easily priced in the market.
Like what sorts of things? Can you give me an example?
Chapter 6 uses a really powerful one, the value of human life itself. The COVID pandemic really brought this to the forefront, forcing us to grapple with how we assign value to life in healthcare decisions and policymaking.
That's a tough one.
It is. Historically, different theories of value often distinguished between what was considered productive and unproductive labor, or activities that created value versus those that just extracted it. But today, those distinctions have mostly disappeared. All financial returns from market activity are often presented as legitimate rewards for creating value, which can sometimes obscure activities that might be more about extracting value than actually creating it for society as a whole.
You mentioned earlier that the value of fiat money hinges on trust. Can you expand on why that trust is so vital?
Absolutely. Unlike currencies tied to something tangible, like gold, the value of modern fiat money relies entirely on public confidence in the institutions that manage it, primarily central banks. Maintaining that confidence requires those institutions to operate with integrity, transparency, and a clear focus on keeping prices stable. Things like bank failures or periods of high inflation, they can seriously damage public trust in the currency and those institutions. That's why independent central banks, with clear objectives and accountability to the public, are seen as so crucial for maintaining a stable and trustworthy currency.
It's like when market logic starts to reach into areas that weren't traditionally commercial, it can change how we see and value those things.
Yeah.
Carney calls this the commercialization effect, right?
Yeah, Chapter 8 gets into this. When market thinking and monetary incentives seep into these non-market areas, it can fundamentally change the meaning and value we attach to those things. That classic example of the Israeli daycare center really illustrates this. They started finding parents who picked up their kids late, hoping to discourage tardiness, but instead late pickups actually increased. The parents started seeing the fine not as a penalty for being late, but as a fee for an extra service.
So trying to use a monetary incentive to solve the problem actually backfired and undermined the intrinsic motivation to be on time out of consideration for the staff.
Exactly. Carney points out that in many areas of our social lives, introducing a monetary incentive isn't just adding something new. It can actually damage our intrinsic motivations, things like altruism, generosity, civic spirit, a sense of responsibility to our community. These are values that often get stronger through practice and social reinforcement. But expanding the market into these social spaces can inadvertently weaken those values and have a negative impact on our overall well-being.
And this feels connected to that growing sense that the social contract is, well, kind of falling apart, especially with all the rising inequality we've been seeing.
Absolutely. Chapter 9 tackles this directly. That basic social contract, which relies on a few key things: a relative equality of outcomes, equal opportunities for everyone, and a sense of fairness across generations, it increasingly feels like it's under pressure, maybe even breaking down. The data clearly show a big increase in inequality, both within and across generations. This is driven by a lot of complex factors, including technology and globalization. And modern capitalism, as it is now, can unintentionally, or maybe intentionally in some cases, reinforce these trends. Those who already have wealth often have access to more diverse income streams and better resources, which widens the gap even further.
And this growing inequality, it has consequences that go beyond just the economy, right? Like eroding trust and our shared sense of, like, morality.
Absolutely. A society where social status seems to be mostly based on wealth, it can create this powerful demonstration effect, potentially encouraging people to chase money, even if it means bending ethical boundaries. We might start to see a greater reliance on external controls, laws, and regulations as our internal moral compasses weaken. You can see this in how some actions that seem, morally questionable, like aggressive tax avoidance or even cheating in sports, might be grudgingly admired for their financial success or cleverness, or even become somewhat normal. Even the common use of financial settlements for wrongdoing can unintentionally contribute to this by seeming to put a price tag on unethical behavior.
The COVID crisis really brought a lot of these underlying tensions and issues to the surface, didn't it?
It did. Chapter 10 argues that COVID was like a giant spotlight on our societal values. It highlighted how crucial the government is in protecting people and showed the high cost of not being prepared, even when we theoretically had the resources. Our cognitive biases, like our tendency to focus on immediate problems over future threats, what's called present bias, that contributed to this underestimation of resilience.
And it forced us to face some really tough ethical questions, particularly about the value of human life.
Yeah, that concept of the value of a statistical life, which is often used in policy decisions to weigh costs and benefits of safety regulations, it came under a lot of scrutiny. These quantitative approaches can offer a framework, but they also have limits, and they can feel very unsettling if they're not used carefully and ethically. The pandemic also exposed the deep inequalities in our society. People's vulnerability to the virus and their ability to cope with lockdowns and the economic fallout, it was clearly linked to their socioeconomic status and their jobs. And this has led to greater expectations for fairness and equality going forward.
And now we have the climate crisis, which feels even bigger and more complex than anything we've dealt with before.
Chapter 11 emphasizes how urgent it is to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just a nice goal, it's essential for stabilizing temperatures and avoiding the worst effects of climate change. The amount of emissions we need to cut each year is enormous, and even with that temporary dip during the COVID lockdowns, we're still nowhere near what's needed. We're seeing the tragedy of the commons play out on a global scale. And the traditional economic solutions, like putting a price on carbon, establishing private property rights for shared resources, or directly managing supply, they all face major practical and political obstacles when you try to apply them globally.
But there's some reasons to be hopeful, right? Like those advances in green technology and the falling costs.
Definitely. The progress in renewable energy, battery storage, and other green technologies is really encouraging. And there's a growing awareness within the financial sector that we need to redirect investments and support the shift to a sustainable, low-carbon economy.
So given all these challenges, what role does leadership play moving forward?
Chapter 13 stresses the importance of values-based leadership. Leaders in all sectors, they face huge challenges today, but they also have this chance to shape a more resilient and fair future based on the principles of purpose-driven capitalism.
Okay.
Carney lays out some core values that should guide companies: dynamism, responsibility, fairness, solidarity, and sustainability. He looks at historical examples like Josiah Wedgwood in the 18th century. Wedgwood was a business leader who cared about his workers' well-being and the social impact of his business, not just profit. He's a good example to follow. The COVID crisis, it really showed us that businesses need a strategic reset, one that puts their core strategies in line with a genuine sense of purpose that balances their business goals with their responsibilities to society.
It seems like it all comes back to social capital, that network of trust and shared values.
It does. Chapter 15 reminds us that markets, they're basically social creations. They rely on rules, norms, and underlying societal values. And if we don't nurture and protect those values, they can erode. To build and strengthen social capital, we need that shared sense of purpose and those common values among people, companies, and countries.
And Carney even talks a bit about Canada's experience with navigating economic shifts, doesn't he?
Yeah, Chapter 16 takes a quick look at Canada's history of resilience when facing economic change. It highlights the opportunity Canada has now to rebalance its economy in response to all these technological and global shifts, emphasizing how important it is to draw on those core Canadian values in the process.
And with technology changing so rapidly, the future of work is a big question mark for a lot of people.
It is. Chapter 17 talks about how the fourth industrial revolution, which was accelerated by the pandemic, is fundamentally changing the nature of work. And this could potentially make inequality even worse. So we need to develop new institutions for the labor market, better protections for gig workers, and a renewed focus on developing people's skills and promoting lifelong learning, what Carney calls quaternary education. All of this is about making sure people have the skills they need to adapt and thrive in this changing work landscape.
All of this really highlights how important it is to have strong and resilient institutions in both the public and private sectors.
Definitely. Chapter 18 stresses that for markets to function well and be fair, we need strong infrastructure. Not just the physical infrastructure, but also the essential regulations and legal frameworks. Accountability and ethical behavior are key because social capital can't be built solely on contracts and laws. It's also crucial to understand systemic risks, those risks that can spread throughout a whole system, and the fallacy of composition. It's the idea that what seems rational for an individual can have bad consequences for the whole system when everyone does it. Like the paradox of thrift, where everyone saving money at the same time can actually hurt the economy. Building and maintaining buffers, like capital reserves and liquidity in the financial system, that's essential for making the whole system more resilient.
And sustainability, it's not just about the environment, right? It's about the long-term well-being of society and the economy.
Exactly. Chapter 19 defines sustainable development as meeting our needs today without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But current trends are eroding the economic, environmental, and social foundations of sustainability. We need to think beyond those short-term economic cycles and build long-term considerations into our policies and decisions today. This includes investing heavily in future energy sources and fostering partnerships, like with indigenous communities, to work towards sustainable development.
So looking ahead, what's the main message we should take away from all of this?
Chapter 20 concludes by saying that to navigate all these big disruptions we're facing, we need to be grounded in core values: fairness, responsibility, resilience, sustainability, dynamism, and solidarity. We have this incredible opportunity to build new economic and social systems based on these principles, ensuring that all the amazing advances in technology benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Wow. This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive into the connection between economic value and our broader values as a society. And it's all thanks to Mark Carney's values. It's clear that how we define and pursue economic value is deeply intertwined with the fundamental values we hold, and that the growing influence of the market has huge implications for our social contract and the kind of future we're creating.
It does. And on that note, here's a final thought to chew on. Think about the things that are most important to you in life that you can't really put a price tag on: your relationships, your sense of community, your well-being, the environment. And consider how this growing emphasis on money in our society might be affecting those things. What can you do, even in small ways, to make sure these vital, non-market values aren't ignored or lost in the constant chase for financial gain?
That's a powerful question to consider. If you want to dive deeper into these crucial issues, we highly recommend checking out Mark Carney's Values. It's a really insightful exploration of all this. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. These are crucial things to think about as we all work towards a more just, sustainable, and ultimately more valuable future for everyone.